Hello and welcome to Let's Read The House of the Dead by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is an audio presentation of the book with occasional clarifying commentary from me, the reader. Now, if you want to jump straight to the action, feel free to skip ahead to the next video in this playlist. To access the playlist itself, check out the video description below. Otherwise, stick around and I'll explain the nature of this project a bit further, while providing some background material on the book. The basic purpose of this Let's Read is to make the literature as accessible as it can be in an audio format. Typically, when you read classical literature in print, you have a number of advantages at your disposal: an introduction from a literary scholar, notes containing background information that might be lost on a modern audience, time to absorb complications in the plot or the cast of characters, and so on. In a conventional audiobook, by contrast, you get simply the spoken text rolling on. But not here. With this project, I will read through the entirety of the book with you, but I will retain the license to add comments where I think it may be helpful to a general audience. In just a moment, I will provide some introductory background information on the work. When completed, this Let's Read will also contain some concluding thoughts on the book, but it will also have some notes sprinkled throughout the reading, simply to clarify points that the average listener could easily miss. I will do my best to keep a light hand and to allow the text to stand on its own. But there will be cases where it will be useful to sum up events or to identify references, and so you will be hearing my comments every so often, just to make sure you don't get lost. I will reserve my own analysis and reactions to the text for the final video of this sequence. When I do have embedded comments in the text, they will virtually always appear at the end of a chapter, in order to avoid breaking up the flow of the narrative. Sometimes, when the text has some detail that invites comment, I will indicate the fact that I have a note on that feature with the following sound. You can pursue that comment at the end of the chapter or not, as you like. There will be other occasions where I will provide clarifying comments visually on the screen. For instance, where a particular expression in either Russian or French requires a translation, or where one character is quoting the words of another in a way that is difficult to parse in audio format. In these cases, I will keep the text flowing, but clarification will be available to you if needed. Now, currently you are viewing this project as part of a YouTube playlist, and I will start making these videos available to the public once I'm about a quarter of the way through the recording. In the past, for other Let's Read projects, I have also provided an alternative format for viewing by assembling all the parts of my playlist into a single video. YouTube restrictions will probably prevent me from doing the latter with a book of the length of The House of the Dead. So probably I will release the project in 2 lengthy installments rather than the single video. If you prefer to listen in lengthier installments, the video description below may show you how to do so. Otherwise, feel free to stick around with this playlist. If you are keeping it here, our next item of business is an introduction to the novel itself. First off, The House of the Dead is in the public domain. The version we will be reading has been translated by Constance Garnett, which differs from the one LibriVox recording of which I am aware and sticks closer to the original. With some searching, you can find this translation online, but it also appears in a Barnes & Noble Classics volume, along with Poor Folk, Dostoevsky's first novel, and a much later short story entitled The Peasant Mary. This project will not cover Poor Folk. However, because of its direct thematic relevance to The House of the Dead, I will present The Peasant Mary toward the end of this Let's Read. In this version, The House of the Dead is about 300 pages long, while The Peasant Mary is a very brief 6 pages. I do commend the Barnes & Noble edition to you, as it comes with a very lucid introduction from Joseph Frank. That introduction is not in the public domain, and so I can't share it with you. However, many of my own comments in this project are indebted to his work, both in this volume and elsewhere. The title of the book is our author's label for the prison camp in Siberia, where he was held for 4 years as a political prisoner. And The House of the Dead is an account of his experiences there. Arguably, it may be regarded as one of Dostoevsky's great works. Certainly, a list of his great works must include 2 full-length novels, The Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment, as well as his novella Notes from Underground. These books are frequently cited even by colleagues of my own discipline. If we extend our list a bit further, we would have to include his novels The Idiot and the Possessed. But if we are extending the list this far, space probably also should be made for The House of the Dead. Indeed, some, including Leo Tolstoy, have suggested that this work is the best thing that Dostoevsky ever wrote. Nevertheless, it is also a very unusual work, and hard to classify. Dostoevsky never wrote anything quite like it at any other time in his career. It is not a novel. The people it describes are real people, not imagined, and it contains no sustained plot to speak of. We can more accurately describe it as the author's autobiographical memoirs, but even that is not quite right. Dostoevsky fictionalizes the identity of the narrator and also rearranges events to produce a more coherent and impactful presentation of the world he is describing. The result is a semi-autobiographical tapestry of vignettes and character sketches, compiled by a remarkably observant and insightful chronicler, keen on opening up the world of the mid-19th century Siberian prison camp to the public eye. Further, he exposes features of human nature to the public eye, and human nature is very much on trial in these pages. As a work of Russian semi-autobiography, The House of the Dead is perhaps anticipated by Turgenev's A Sportsman sketches and Tolstoy's Sevastopol stories, both of which had appeared shortly earlier. But The House of the Dead is sometimes thought to be the first in a long history of Russian prison literature, which perhaps reaches its zenith in Solzhenitsyn's Soviet-era 3-volume classic, The Gulag Archipelago. In the context of Dostoevsky's own career, however, the significance of The House of the Dead is that it serves as a sort of milestone that signifies the kind of author he would become. The youthful Dostoevsky of the 1840s was a clever man with surprising psychological intuition. But he also suffered from a touch of naivete, and he could never have written the great literary works I enumerated a moment ago. But by the 1860s and 70s, he was doing exactly that. What happened during those critical years in Siberia to increase the range and depth of his vision to such an extent? The House of the Dead goes a long way toward providing an answer. Part of its great success in reviving Dostoevsky's literary reputation lay in its immaculate timing. The first few chapters were published serially from late 1860 through early 1861 in an obscure journal called The Russian Word. When Dostoevsky's own journal, Time, got off the ground, it ran the entirety of The House of the Dead from 1861 through 1862. Meanwhile, the liberation of the serfs occurred in the February of 1861, and with it came a wave of liberal political energy. Dostoevsky, a political prisoner at the hands of an oppressive czar, had returned to Petersburg after a decade of suffering and imprisonment and then exile, with an aura of martyrdom surrounding him. His message of what he had experienced and of the peasant convicts who suffered with him found a very sympathetic audience, and it quickly vaulted him to an exalted status among the Russian intelligentsia. In 1861 he was also publishing The Insulted and Injured, which was read with enthusiasm by the Russian public, if not the literary critics. But The House of the Dead earned him a lasting fame in all literate circles. Here is one anecdote concerning its popularity. In early 1862, with political unrest fomenting over the fate of the newly liberated peasant class, the Tsarist government instituted new regulations on universities, which sparked student protest, which in turn led to student arrests. The indignant intelligentsia organized several events in response, and Dostoevsky was frequently asked to read from his works at them. During one fateful evening, he opened events with a carefully chosen chapter from The House of the Dead, working up a crowd of 3,000 in the process. By the end of the evening, there was a near riot, although it eventually calmed down. Dostoevsky wasn't the only player in the proceedings that night, but he was a significant one. Today, removed as we are from the political circumstances of its composition, we are more interested in this book for the timeless lessons it gives us about human nature. But this in turn is best understood when we consider the effect prison had on the ideas of the author, how it moved him from one perspective to another. To get the full picture, then, we need to know who Dostoevsky was before going to Siberia, why he was arrested in the first place, and what his character and ideas had been like before encountering the dead house. Dostoevsky was arrested in 1849 because of his participation in the Sochaczewski Circle, a group of progressive-minded intellectuals who would meet at the home of one Sochaczewski and discuss the affairs of the day. To all appearances, they would look like a harmless debate group, capable of a great deal of talk and no action. Underneath the surface, there was more going on. A secret inner circle within the larger group was planning on stirring up a peasant revolt. Dostoevsky was a member of that conspiracy. It is hard to imagine that the effort would have had any success, even if left unimpeded, yet it never had the opportunity. The secret police had infiltrated the Sochaczewski Circle in 1848 due to the Tsar's increased anxiety about revolutions all over Europe, and they pulled the plug on the group with a round of arrests in April of the following year. Before its demise, the Circle had represented a variety of perspectives, but virtually all of the figures attending would subscribe to some form of socialism. Sochaczewski himself had attempted to form a commune on his estate in the mold of Charles Fourier, although the peasants, the presumed beneficiaries of the arrangement, burned it to the ground within 24 hours. As is typical with socialists, Sochaczewski was undeterred by recalcitrant empirical evidence. For his own part, Dostoevsky might have passively identified as a socialist, but he did not express much enthusiasm for political affairs per se, and he strongly disliked the militant atheism that was frequently on display. His presence in the circle was largely due to his hatred of the institution of serfdom and to his concern over the plight of the poor. It was his hatred of serfdom that motivated his participation in the revolutionary conspiracy, and it was his concern for the poor and downtrodden that emerges as a defining theme of his earliest published writings. Certainly that is the overwhelming impression of his debut novel, Poor Folk, and it continues in short stories such as An Honest Thief, or A Faint Heart, or A Christmas Tree and a Wedding, and perhaps also in the first few chapters of Natochka Nezvanova. In these early writings, he turns a sympathetic eye toward the poorer classes of Petersburg society, often low-level bureaucrats struggling to make ends meet, and he attempts to get into their minds and portray their motivations in a way that commends them to the sentiments of the Russian literati. His intuition is often penetrating. Nevertheless, on an honest appraisal, some of these works suggest that the author had limited experience with the kinds of characters he is describing. One notable example is An Honest Thief, in which a destitute drunkard robs a friend to fund his alcoholism, is tortured by the pangs of conscience, and ultimately confesses to his theft moments before his death. This is a pleasant little romanticizing of the desperately poor, but is it an accurate portrayal of what thieves or drunkards are like? An assumption that runs through many of these early works is that the poor are forever the victims of forces external to themselves. The social pressures on the lower classes are intolerable. The terrified clerks and government bureaucracies do what they can to make ends meet or to ease their pain, occasionally resorting to drink, such as Devushkin in Poor Folk, or to hoarding, such as Mr. Proharchin from an early story, or to blackmail, such as Polzunkov from another. A rearranging of society, we are invited to infer, may be the best way of preventing these lapses of character. But is that the whole picture of the origins of human vice? For that matter, the revolutionary Dostoevsky was apparently willing to assume that the peasant class would actually respond to the call to revolt from upper-class leadership and would submit themselves to their direction. Was that a reasonable assumption? Dostoevsky was about to get clarity on these and other issues in the dead house in Siberia. He would later say that the experience led to, quote, the regeneration of my convictions, unquote. He would never lose his concern for the plight of the poor or his interest in the social pressures that they face. But he would later see things in a much clearer light, revising some of his ideas and embracing them with an even stronger fervor. But before he could get to Siberia, he would already encounter a life-altering moment. After his arrest, he spent about a year in the Peter and Paul fortress in Petersburg and was submitted to several rounds of interrogation. He appears to have acquitted himself admirably under duress, and as far as we know, the authorities never did find out about the inner revolutionary conspiracy of which he was a part. Yet in December of 1849, moments after being suddenly transported to Semenovsky Square, he discovered his apparent sentence: execution by firing squad. The sentence was a sham, and an elaborate show was made of a breathless messenger arriving from the Tsar with a commuted sentence a moment before the first of the Petrashevtsi, tied to stakes on the scaffold, were to be shot. Nevertheless, for that moment, Dostoevsky stared into the abyss of death. If we wonder about the occasionally apocalyptic flavor of his mature works, this episode may offer a partial explanation of its origin. The Tsar's actual sentence was to years of imprisonment in Siberia. The members of the Petrashevsky circle would be mostly dispersed and sent to different camps. Naturally, the journey from Petersburg to Siberia is a long one. Before he could reach his prison camp, he stopped in Tobolsk, the capital of western Siberia and a sort of way station for these prison convoys. Our author will occasionally refer to his time there in the pages ahead. While in Tobolsk, he received consolation from 3 widows of political prisoners of an earlier age, receiving from them a New Testament with 10 rubles in the binding, as well as a warning about the sadistic major who ran the prison to which he was assigned. From Tobolsk, Dostoevsky set off for Omsk, the location of his prison camp. With him was only one companion from Petersburg, a poet named Sergei Durov, who is obliquely mentioned in the text, although never by name. They arrived several days later, and the House of the Dead tells us what he experienced while there. There is one last detail about the youthful Dostoevsky that deserves to be mentioned. The Dostoevsky of the 1840s was an extremely sensitive, thin-skinned man. That sensitivity was part of what made him good at his work. He could understand the sentiments of others. But it also made him a nervous wreck, with an excessive vanity and a strong self-conscious desire for acceptance. Further, his involvement with the conspiracy presented an intolerable strain on his nerves. He would confess later that, had he not been arrested, he would have gone mad. Also, it appears that his psychological frailty had some physiological effects, although our sources from the period are a bit murky. A friend of his, one Dr. Yanovsky, reports that he attended to the author's fainting fits during this time, which may have followed hallucinations. By the time he returned from Siberia, we know that he was suffering from severe epileptic fits. In general, his was a particularly delicate constitution to be subjected to the hardships, both moral and physical, of the prison camp. And those hardships were in fact greater than may be gleaned from a reading of The House of the Dead. That is because Dostoevsky had to deal with the threat of censorship. In order to save face for the authorities, and thus to get past the censor, he had to pull his punches, papering over the conditions he had to face during those years. The irony is that the censor still complained about the work, but for the opposite reason. He worried that the conditions looked too attractive to the reader, so that some of the desperately poor would be tempted to commit crimes in order to go to Siberia. To get a sense of the reality of what Dostoevsky faced, rather than the more sanitized version deemed fit for public consumption, it is worth looking at an excerpt from a letter he wrote to his brother immediately after his release, where he describes prison life with more candor. Here is what he says. Quote, "Things were very bad for us. A military prison is much worse than a civilian one. I spent the whole 4 years in the prison behind walls and never went out except to work. The work they found for us was heavy, not always, of course, and I was sometimes completely exhausted in foul weather, in damp and rain and sleet, and in the unendurable cold of winter. Once I spent 4 hours on urgent work when the mercury froze and there was perhaps about 40 degrees of frost. My foot became frostbitten. We lived on top of each other, all together in one barrack. Imagine an old, dilapidated wooden construction, which was supposed to have been pulled down long ago and which was no longer fit for use. In summer, intolerable closeness. In winter, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten. Filth on the floors an inch thick. One could slip and fall. The little windows were so covered with frost that it was almost impossible to read at any time of the day. An inch of ice on the panes. drips from the ceiling, draughts everywhere. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. The stove took 6 logs at once, but there was no warmth. The ice in the room barely thawed. Only unendurable fumes, and this all winter long. There in the barracks the convicts washed their clothes, and the whole space was splashed with water. There was no room to turn around. From dusk to dawn it was impossible not to behave like pigs, for after all we're live human beings. We slept on bare boards and were allowed only a pillow. We spread our sheepskin coats over us, and our feet were always uncovered all night. We shivered all night. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. In winter we wore short sheepskin coats, often of the most wretched quality, which hardly gave any warmth, and on our feet half-boots. Just try to walk around with them in the freezing cold. I often lay ill in the hospital. Disordered nerves have given me epilepsy, but the fits occur only rarely. I have rheumatism in the legs besides. Apart from this, I feel fairly well. Add to all these amenities the almost complete impossibility of possessing a book, and if you get one, you read it on the sly. The eternal hostility and quarreling around one, the wrangling, shouting, uproar, din, always under escort, never alone, and all this for 4 years without change. Really, one must be pardoned for saying that things were bad. Besides all this, the eternal threat of punishment hanging over one, shackles, the total stifling of the soul. There you have an image of my existence." Unquote. The public account contained in The House of the Dead is consistent with the passage in this letter, but it omits many of these alarming details, and so the effect is not quite as stark. This muting of the details for the purpose of passing censorship will come up frequently in the book, as I will occasionally note in my comments. The threat of censorship may also have been a cause for one of the fictitious narrative devices that Dostoevsky employs in the book. The work is mostly autobiographical, and it was certainly read that way by his audience. But Dostoevsky never officially appears in the book. Instead, his figure is obscured by the presence of 2 different narrators. The first is a nameless inhabitant of a Siberian town, who, in the introduction to Part 1, finds himself in the possession of a collection of notes from one Aleksander Petrovich Goryanchikov, an ex-convict who, after his release from prison, remained in Siberia until his recent death. This nameless narrator then assumes the role of editor of these notes, and promptly drops out of the picture almost entirely, except for a brief cameo at the beginning of Part 2, Chapter 7. The rest of the book is ostensibly from the perspective of this Goryanchikov. The nameless editor informs us that Goryanchikov had been a landowner who was imprisoned for 10 years on the charge of murdering his wife in a jealous rage. How seriously we should take this fictional figure is a point of some debate. Some scholars will interpret the book in a way that gives Goryanchikov a great deal of significance. But most will dismiss Goryanchikov as a mere facade, perfunctorily propped up in order to keep the censor at bay. Certainly that is the way Dostoevsky's immediate readers in the 1860s understood him, and the book itself encourages this reading, as our principal narrator will frequently refer to himself as a political prisoner, not the land-owning murderer described in the introduction. For all intents and purposes, Goryanchikov's voice is really the voice of Dostoevsky himself. There is one other way in which Dostoevsky fictionalizes his account. he rearranges the sequence of events in order to fit his narrative purposes. His narrator, Goryanchikov, was in the prison camp for 10 years, but he himself was only imprisoned for 4. For his remaining time in Siberia, he was forced to serve in the military. Dostoevsky arrived at the camp in January of 1850. In his presentation of events, however, his narrator arrives a month or so before Christmas, and he describes Christmas theatricals as taking place at that time, when in fact he did not observe them until much later. This sort of thing is the rule and not the exception. He will repackage his experiences in order to open up the prison world to his reader in a coherent and vivid way. To the best of my knowledge, everything he describes really did occur, although not in the order he presents. The book divides into 2 parts. In part 1, after our frame narrator's introduction, we walk through Goryanchikov's first encounter with the prison, up through the first couple of months, ending with the Christmas holiday, although Dostoevsky will sometimes jump around chronologically as he pursues various ideas. Part 2 is arranged topically, as we zoom through the remainder of Goryanchikov's sentence, and finishes with his release from the prison. The character who enters the prison in the first chapter of Part 1 is a rather different person in the last chapter of Part 2, and much of the movement of the book involves how that transformation takes place. More light is shed on that transformation in The Peasant Mary, the short story appended at the end of this Let's Read. Finally, we should say a bit about the other characters populating these pages. The list of figures in this book is incredibly vast. Much of the narrative involves brief character descriptions, and many of them appear only once. Providing a complete cast of characters here would thus be hopelessly inefficient and would spoil much of what Dostoevsky has to say. However, several figures appear more than once, and with a list of characters this large, it may be hard to remember who they are when they are referred to a second or a third time. So I have included a selected dramatis personae for your reference. These are not all the characters who appear in the text, and not always the most important. Some omissions from this list may be more significant than some who are on it. But these characters pop up more than once, and so this list may be of some use to you going forward. Of course, as noted earlier, we have our 2 narrators, the unnamed frame narrator, and the prisoner Goryanchikov, who is speaking with Dostoevsky's voice. The officer in charge of the prison is an unnamed major, although he is nicknamed 8 Eyes by the convicts. His orderly is named Fedka. There are 3 Russian upper-class convicts who get some attention throughout. The most significant is Akim Akimich, who will play a role as Goryanchikov's companion. There is an unnamed gentleman who was accused of killing his father, and there is a character known only as A, who serves as a spy for the major and for whom Goryanchikov holds a strong revulsion. M, B, T, and Z are also gentlemen convicts, but they are Polish, not Russian. All are political prisoners. M plays the biggest role among them. Most of the other characters of note are lower-class convicts. We hear early on of one Petrov, who at one point came close to attacking the major when he was unjustly punished. He pops up relatively frequently and has a fair amount of contact with Goryanchikov. Another frequently appearing convict is Baklushin, sometimes called the Pioneer, due to his past participation in a certain military unit. His most distinctive physical feature is a wart on his cheek. He, too, appears somewhat frequently in the text, and like many figures in the text, he has a striking backstory. Isai Fomich Bumstein is a Jewish convict who swiftly sets up shop as the prison pawnbroker. Gazin is the name of the biggest vodka smuggler in the camp, who becomes especially dangerous when drunk. Sushilov, by contrast, is a remarkably servile character who attaches himself to Goryanchikov and is our narrator's example of a natural-born beggar. Fairly early, we learn of a convict who became sick by drinking vodka laced with snuff. This man's name is Ustyanzev, and we hear a bit more about his story later on. Late in the book, we become familiar with one Kulikov, an older, former veterinarian who develops a sort of rivalry for position as best animal doctor among the prison population. He plays a role in a little adventure down the stretch. There are also a number of minor figures who pop up more than once. There is a stocky man named Skuratov, who frequently takes on the role of buffoon. Osip is the name of a very large but very meek cook, who can't help but stay involved in the role of vodka smuggler. There is an elderly man, sometimes referred to as grandfather, who has a religious affiliation as an old believer, and who is trusted to keep money for other convicts. Sirotkin is the name of a gentle young convict who later pops up in the prison theatricals. At the end of Part 1, Chapter 2, we encounter a jocular, muscular, middle-aged man who begs some extra food off his companions. This man's name is Varlamov, and we see more of him during the Christmas activities. And there are more, although I think they may be safely passed over on this selective list. I may choose to list off convicts again at another stopping point, matching the criminals to their purported crimes. But to do so now would spoil things, and it is high time to let Dostoevsky take center stage. So, sit back and enjoy The House of the Dead.